Hello and welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at UC San Diego and at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, or GPS for short. GPS has 7-degree programs, including a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If our program offerings are of interest to you, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center at GPS, and more information about our activities can be found at jfit.ucsd.edu. When you go to that website, jfit.ucsd.edu, you will find a tab called News and Media, where you can sign up for our bi-weekly news flash, which is a Japan San Diego fun newsletter, not your normal news. And right next to that tab is actually the Japan Zoominars tab, where you can find recorded past meetings. And we're building that out, and it will soon be called the JZ Gallery. If that's all too complicated, just go to my own private website, which is thejapanologist.com. So this is a weekly event. We meet every Tuesday, 4:30 p.m. San Diego time, which is Wednesday mornings, 8:30 in Tokyo. And we will have, of course, today, Professor Maclachlan with us. Here's a preview of what's coming up next week. My colleague and friend Takeo Hashi has 2 new books out, Agonomics and one on the Japanese economy. And so we'll have a conversation with him about these 2 volumes, followed by Christine Yano from the University of Hawaii, who will talk about her work on Hello Kitty and why Japanese pop culture is so popular around the world. Followed by Corky White from Boston University and her work on coffee life in Japan. So as I mentioned, our Zoominars are recorded, and you can find links to past events at our website, jfit.ucsd.edu. Because it's recorded, when you raise a question through the chat function today during our meeting, I will not refer to you by your last name. I'll only use your first name to ensure your privacy. Okay, so then let's talk about today's topic. So here are the books that Professor Maclachlan has written. One is 2 on consumer politics in post-war Japan, 1 on the People's Post Office, and the 3rd one coming up. This is not the actual cover. It'll soon be out, or maybe next year, actually early next year, and it is about Japanese farmers. And I was looking at those books, and I thought I would like to have Professor Maclachlan here with us to discuss the Japanese policies for parts of Japanese society that could easily be overlooked or remain unheard. And her work is really about how to give voice to the common people, whether that's the housewives, or the older elderly, or the regional people, or the farmers, small groups of society that could easily be left behind if one doesn't pay attention. And that's an interesting topic to me. And I'll show you one more slide before I introduce Patty. This is an interesting topic to me because of the inequality issue. So these are 2 lines here. The upper line is the United States. The lower line is the Japan, the red one. And each of them has a trend line. And what these represent is the estimated share of total income of the 1% richest people. And what you see here is that in the United States, that share used to be 10%, and it is now almost 20%. So 1% of people make 20% of total income. And in Japan, it's at roughly 15. So there's a big difference between the United States and Japan, but Japan's line is by no means flat. And so that is a concern in Japan right now. It's also a topic that we want to talk about. And so with that, let me stop this share. And here is Professor Patty Maclachlan. Hello, Patty.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you on the show. So let me introduce you. So Patricia Maclachlan is a professor of government and Asian studies and the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Professor of Japanese Studies at the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. She earned her degrees in Canada, where she hails from, at UBC, a BA and MA, I guess, and then a PhD in political science from Columbia University, where she studied with Jerry Curtis. She has written, as I just showed you, or edited 4+ books and many, many, many more articles. They're all on Japanese civil society, postal politics, agricultural reform, and these topics that we will discuss today. She's a member of the U.S.-Japan Friendship Commission. She has served on the American Advisory Committee of the Japan Foundation and is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Japanese Studies. Thank you, Patty, for all your service to the Japan community, and welcome to the Japan Zoomina.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. So let's dig right in. Okay, so audience, real quick, if you have a question and would like to steer the conversation, please type it up in the Q&A, and I will try to weave it into the conversation, and I will also share the Q&A comments with our speaker today later. Okay, so the US is hurting. Right? I think that's fair to say. And we seem to be all but immobilized. You know, we have economic, social, political divisions. And at the same time, Japan, though, seems to be pretty much okay. I mean, particularly from a Western perspective. Why do you think that is?
I think that's a really good question. And I do think you're correct, first of all, to preface it with the observation that Japan does have its share of troubles right now. It's not as equal a society as it used to be. There's employment precarity, low wages for many people. The gap between rich and poor has been increasing. And then of particular interest to me now, the gap between rural society and urban society has become precarious with the collapse of a lot of rural economies. So those are really serious issues. But you're right, I think, to point out that when compared to the United States, Japan seems to be doing better. Somehow it feels more socially stable, politically stable, and the economy seems to be chugging along with some problems, but could be a lot worse. And that's something that I think about a lot, and sometimes my answers to that question change, but off the top of my head, I'd say 2 or 3 sets of issues. And the first would be, I think, a long history of success and acceptance of redistributive policies. I think sometimes people will call it Robin Hood policies of taxing richer segments of society and channeling it through both tax breaks and price supports to the less advantaged parts of society. And in particular, I'm thinking about farmers. So redistribution during the post-war, during rapid growth, was really key in making sure that that income gap between rural and urban Japan didn't break open. And in fact, until the late 1990s, average farmer was making more than the average worker. It's only toward the end of that decade that things really change. So I think a history of public policy with an eye to equality, particularly redistribution, which in the US is very controversial, and it's certainly getting more politically controversial in Japan. Another reason I think has to do, this is harder to explain, but I think a lot of the institutions and programs that are connected to public policy have a depth and thickness and pervasiveness in society that can be beneficial for social welfare purposes. And you noted 2 of the books that I've worked on have been on the postal system and the Japanese agriculture, and particularly the JA, the Agricultural Cooperative. I'm publishing a book with Kei Shimizu on this. And in both of these systems, I'm always struck by the extensiveness of the networks of the post office or the co-ops, the fact that these networks provide cradle-to-grave services, the fact that they operate on the principle of equality and universality. Everyone is free to open up a postal savings account. It's for small savers. Every farmer is a member of JA, which decreases their risk and basically gives them, I think, a very important floor to their lifestyles in struggling rural areas. Now, these systems are problematic. They're economically inefficient. They've caused political corruption. We can go down that list for several more minutes, but when all is said and done, I do think that they have served very important social functions, and particularly in terms of helping the common man, or at least preventing that proverbial common man from slipping too far behind. And then I think underscoring both of those points, there are certain values in Japan that have persisted, I think, throughout the 20th century. They might be struggling now, they're more contested politically, but the idea of equality, of no one should be left behind. I've seen that in the postal services. I've seen that in efforts to reform JA. It's still a big issue. And I think those values inform society. And I think they're also reflected in the political system. Now I could go on and on about the political system. Maybe I'll leave that till later, but it's not as divided as Japan. It's not as ideologically divided, or in terms of partisanship. There are no real ideological parties in Japan like there are now in the United States. And I think that might be a fourth factor behind the relative stability in Japan.
Yeah, so the I didn't want to start there, but let's go there since you bring it up. It's just the sort of a societal agreement of what is the right behavior around people that are not as well off, right? So first of all, they're treated with respect. So even a tiny little greengrocer at the who's really not producing anything much for the economy will still be greeted and welcome in the neighborhood and treated with, as if it was really important. But then there is a cost to this. There's a trade-off to everything. And you started talking about the inefficiencies. I was thinking more about the straitjacket that some of this brings, right? So you can't say certain things. You can't just be efficient. Equality as a number one rule runs counter to equity, right? So the smart people, the very efficient startup guys, are wondering why all of this attention is going to the inefficient sectors, or the old people, or do you have any thoughts on that, or should we leave that for later in the conversation?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind are electoral incentives. The Japanese co-op system is what it is in part because farmers have been one of the biggest electoral groups that can really make or break elections in various kinds of constituencies. They have exchange relationships with the LDP in which they mobilize the vote behind specific candidates, particularly in all throughout the electoral system. Sometimes as many as 1 million votes in a particular election, although that number is going down and their clout, the organized vote, is definitely decreasing. But you can say the same thing about the postmasters. They're one of the largest vote mobilization machines connected to the LDP. And so these inefficiencies which accompany the positive social welfare contributions of these networks are very much a result of their political heft, their electoral heft, which creates these gross inefficiencies. And I find that a real interesting and problematic dilemma for Japan. And I think they continue to grapple with this. We saw it with Nakasone in the 1980s, and certainly Koizumi in the 2000s, Abe. How do we keep the unique nature, very distinctive anyway, nature of these informal social welfare provisions of these otherwise grossly economically inefficient economic services for society? Where do you find that sweet spot? And I think Japan's constantly trying to find that target. And it's a source of great controversy politically. But I think those electoral sources of influence are really key in understanding why they're slow to change.
So that's what's interesting about this. It's a question of trade-offs. You can't have it all. And Japan is making very different trade-offs from the ones that we are making here. And so there's an interesting aspect to this, which is, can we learn something from how Japan is? Are there some ideas there that might work? Let's start with the consumer book. This goes back 20 years, very carefully done research. You actually went and and stayed with the housewives. And the
I
housewives.
didn't live with them, but I did talk to a lot of them.
Oh, okay. So I thought you were actually sort of becoming a Japanese housewife there,
Yeah.
but you did. But the housewives are quite organized, and the Shufuren, as it's known in Japan, has long been a political actor. Can you talk a little bit about the findings that this is what 20 years ago now, something like
An old
that?
book now.
Yeah, it's an old book, but
I was very interested in Shufuren and other housewives organizations for a number of reasons. And I want to say from the outset, there's been a lot of great research done by political scientists, sociologists, and historians about housewives and the political system since that book was written. And so I don't know everything there is to know about housewives. What I do know is how they've behaved, how they've performed as consumer advocates. So what brought me to those organizations was a project that was focused on the consumer movement in the legislative process. And when I arrived in Japan, I knew this before I arrived, but it was drummed into me when I got to Japan to do this research, which was as a PhD student, that the consumer movement is basically the Housewives Association. At least it was through the bulk of the post-war era. It's now changing a little. So, so for me, I don't know how deeply you want to get into this, but a number of interesting things come out of this research for me. Like, why are the women, why is the consumer movement identified with women when in the United States we're used to Ralph Nader being in charge? Although that too, I think, is a misperception, because in the United States there have been consumer movements that go way back into the 19th century that predate Ralph Nader. But nevertheless, why are there no Ralph Naders in Japan? And why are these women, these housewives organizations, at the front end of the movement? So that resulted in some interesting research. And my response to that has to do primarily with historical sequencing. Women had the first mover advantage in the consumer movement. The consumer movement starts in Japan. The post-war movement didn't really exist before that. Starts in the occupation period and is focused on shortages in the rationing system. And who is it that felt those pressures first? But the housewives, who were lined up at the rice vendors, waiting for their meager rations of rice, sometimes for hours at a time. And they do this day after day, week after week, and they discover firsthand how bad the system is working, how broken the agriculture and distribution systems are in Japan. And they start talking, and these groups start forming at the local level to put pressure on the rationing system and businesses, providers who are connected to that rationing network. And it eventually results in a few, the most famous case is, of course, in 1948, it results in the formation of Shufuren by Okurumeo. And they were there first. And they did a lot, I think, to define the kinds of issues that are important for Japan. Now there are, and it's consumer movement. Now there are a number of other reasons, I think, why women dominate. The fact that there are no Ralph Naders in Japan, for example, has to do with another important force, which is the lack of a public interest legal tradition in Japan. There are no public interest lawyers in Japan to take this sort of thing on. But I really think that historical timing of women and their experiences during the occupation highlight why the movement is dominated by women. And a related note that also interested me, and you'll have to shut me up because I could go on and on, but I'll give you one or two more examples. Another thing that was really interesting at the time is the kinds of issues that were of interest to the movement. So I went to Japan as a researcher for the first time in the early 1990s. And the big question then was, why aren't Japanese consumer advocates clamoring against high prices, the results of the bubble economy? And some critics in the United States were saying there really is no consumer movement in Japan. And I kind of thought, well, yeah, there is a consumer movement. They just prioritize different things. And so the lack of a real movement behind those astronomically high prices in the 1980s in particular, I think was a product of the fact that the economic pie was growing and people could afford them, although I don't want to exaggerate that point. It had to do with, I think, the diffuseness of the consumer interest Everyone's a consumer, but they're also workers and producers. And women happen to be married to small producers who are in the Shufudan and Chifudan and the other housewives organizations. And they tend to temper their narrowly defined consumer interest because of their family connections and the fact that their livelihoods are actually benefiting from these high prices, which advantage the small grocer or the banker in the Shotengai, et cetera, in which these women are heavily entrenched. But also, perhaps most importantly, I think, what is of importance to the Japanese consumer movement really reflects through the post-war historical period what's of importance to women as wives and mothers. So you'll see far more activism on issues like food safety, product safety, than you will on high prices. And that's been true, I think, throughout the post-war era.
So I have a bookmark in this. The last chapter is of this book on the consumers is the right to be heard. And my first, I studied business, but I certainly knew about Shufudan from the get-go because the Shufudan were often represented in the deliberation councils of the ministries when a new policy was, but by the time they were fully organized, right? There was usually a Shufudan representative in the policy-making councils of METI and trying to, get a voice in, or maybe they were co-opted. I don't know which way that era went, but they were definitely there, and they were heard. And is that something they had to fight for, or did the government actually see that it's a good idea to have the Shufudan involved in this?
To a degree, the Japanese consumer organizations don't have a whole lot of political power historically, but they represent we'd say the population in an important dimension of daily life. And I think particularly from the late 60s, when the LDP was recognizing that for political purposes and electoral purposes, we have to pay attention to quality of life issues. Like, I don't want to accuse the LDP of being insincere, but of environmental pollution, consumer rights, et cetera, safe products. And those are a great concern to the Japanese people. And so I think there was an element of symbolic politics to this. Let's let these representatives onto our committees. So their voices are heard, but are their voices acted on is an entirely a different issue. So the victories, the policy victories of the consumer movement have been few and far between. In that book, there is actually one case study of a real success, and that's their efforts to push forward a product liability law that was enacted in 1994. That's when we talked about me running around with housewives. It was on the street with my placard and talking about the need for product liability. That movement really did result in some positive policy change, legal change. And it reflected probably the most well-organized inter-organization mass movement that went on for years and years that the movement has been able to put together. So that was a success. And one reason why it did manage to get what it wanted, and that's the legislation, is that businesses tended to be somewhat divided on these issues. Some felt the product liability legislation, no-fault liability for defective products, was an issue whose time had come, and the legitimacy of the business community depended on acknowledging it. But there was also some resistance. But I think those divisions amongst the real power holders in that particular sphere gave women's organizations and other consumer groups an inroad.
Let's go to the post office, shall we? So this is his next book, The People's Post Office, and you were, I guess you were, what triggered this was Prime Minister Koizumi making the privatization of the post office his platform on which he then campaigned and succeeded. And that was because this was at a time when a lot of people in Japan thought that the government was in too many businesses, and with whether that's the highway construction or the school lunches, and the post office was thrown into that mix, and all of these. And Koizumi, of course, had this motto, leave to the private sector what the private sector can do. And so let's privatize the post office, which to this day has not happened, unless
No.
I'm mistaken. But in any event, he tried. And we had a lot of interesting conversations while you were writing this. The one that I've bookmarked here, and I remember it, that we talked about this, is that you realized at some point in doing this research that the post office is of course doing much more than just delivering letters. And my little post note is here: the postal services in Japanese society, right? And so the post guys, and this is particularly true, I guess, in the regions, but also in Tokyo and large, sort of cities or urban places where there's less of a neighborhood community. The postal guy, the post delivery person, usually male in Japan, the postman, would notice if an elderly was not picking up their mail or would not answer the door. And what is up with Watanabe-san? Why is Watanabe-san not at the window? Why is he not shouting back when I call her name, right? And so you were looking into the sort of the social cohesion provision of the postal services. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Right. Yeah, that was a surprise to me when I went to Japan and wandered around and went to different areas and saw how the postal system actually worked on the ground. The service that you refer to is not etched in law anywhere. And remember that until 2007, it's a public corporation, although that's another issue. We'll talk about that later maybe. But informal welfare provisions is something that evolved naturally, I think, out of the postal system in many local communities, particularly in rural areas. And a lot of post offices would network with small businesses, providers, pharmacies, grocers, other medical assistance services, and they would arrange for the postal carrier on his or her rounds to knock on the door of an elderly resident, living alone usually, with perhaps some issues. And if they didn't answer the door, or if in particular, they put a little yellow flag in their window, I think it was yellow, hence himawari or sunflower. Yes, I think it was yellow. That was the signal that the postal carrier's services were required above and beyond delivering the mail. So they would take orders from these elderly residents for sometimes groceries, particularly medicinal products, and deliver it to those in the informal network. And the providers would see to it that those elderly residents received their subscription refills or whatever, prescription refills or whatever it was that they needed. So this built on a long tradition in the post office, I think, of employees within the post office leaving the office and going door to door, like door to door salesmen, to sell postal insurance policies or particular savings instruments under the postal savings system. In fact, they had noruma, these quotas that they had to fulfill in a given year. They had to sell a certain amount. So there are these contacts that are happening anyway in the post system that have gone on for decades. And it's one of the secrets for why postal savings system, and particularly postal insurance system, I think this is very important in that services case, why these services tended to do better in many areas than their private competitors. So there's a long tradition of face-to-face contact by postal employees and their clients on their client's doorstep. And I think it was just a step further in the context of demographic decline in these rural areas that the post office began to implement these informal social welfare services to serve the elderly. They also started things like block parent, almost like a block parent, where postal carriers would report on children in trouble while doing their rounds and they were on the way to school. If they saw some kid being harassed, they would report it. They saw potholes in the road, they would report it to the local government. So they were monitors from various perspectives and the local level as well. And it just highlighted how these networks, these organizations that are embodied by the postal system can be transformed for other purposes depending on the needs of the local community. And that speaks to, let's not leave anyone behind in our society. Here's a network that can actually do that.
So that's Great, right? So what's important here is that unlike in the United States, the Japanese post office has or used to have these other functions like the insurance, the
Right.
savings account, the banking services, and also the postmasters, which were
Right.
also political.
Yeah.
I don't want to call them agents. What is the right word here?
Yeah.
What do I want to say?
They were.
Okay, let's call them
They
that.
still are.
So they were also vote gatherers.
Yes. Yes. So they gathered the vote, much like the co-ops gathered the vote. But before 2007, it was illegal. It was a violation of the electoral law. And so they would do it very quietly, or they'd recruit their wives to do it, or better yet, their retired colleagues who used to run the post offices. And the retired colleagues formed an organization called Taiju, which means like big branch, which is widely viewed as the largest electoral arm of the LDP during the post-war era. And they would convince people very subtly, usually the wives would do this very subtly to, sometimes not so subtly, to vote a certain way. So they were opinion leaders within local areas and had enormous influence, I think, particularly in the early post-war era, when voters were influenced in their vote decisions by the organizational context in which they spent much of their workaday lives. So they had a major impact that way. By the way, it's no longer illegal for the postmasters to gather the vote. One of the great things to come out of postal privatization is that they're no longer public servants, they're private citizens, and they can perform these functions without legal retribution. But then one other thing, just to point out about these postmasters, one of the inefficiencies of them, because I'm painting too rosy a picture here. There's some bad stuff here as well. And the problems with the postmasters is that the bulk of them run special post offices that I called commissioned post offices. It's a rough translation for Tokutei Yubin Kyokucho, so specially designated post office. And these were postal post offices that were inherited through the generations, through parents to children and so on down the generations. And they were operated from the postmaster's own home, which is very unusual. Britain has something similar, but not quite. But it's one of the few examples that I know of in the modern world of a bureaucratic position actually inherited through a family line. And that's also a source of major corruption, but also a source of the social capital that these postmasters, whose fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers used to run the same post office, they developed what the postmasters would call chiense, which means sort of like local connectedness. And they would use that connectedness and that historical inheritance to influence their local residents, not just for the sale of postal insurance and postal savings accounts, but also in terms of gathering the vote.
So that's why Koizumi wanted to privatize the post office, right? Because it was supporting the old sort of fuddy-duddies in the LDP, if I may call them that. But what happened to the social function then? So did Koizumi have his way, and is this now undermined, or could we still see it if we went to some rural place, in the
right? It still works. It still works, but for me, when I was studying postal privatization, I saw it not just as a political or an economic conflict or battle. It was a cultural battle, because Koizumi's vision of a privatized postal service, and by the way, he eventually came around to saying the mail service should always be government run. He was talking about the financial services, but the privatization would be good for the economy. It would create a level playing field with private providers in the financial sector, would help reinvigorate Japanese banks. I think he was right. But his detractors argued privatize the postal services, even the financial services, and certain post offices will go out of business, and not everyone will be served equally. Universal service will disappear, and the kaksa between the haves and the have-nots will increase. And that tug of war between, let's call them neoliberals for lack of a better word. I find that sometimes that term is used unfairly in a pejorative way. Sometimes some neoliberalism is a good thing for Japan, versus the traditionalists who saw in the post office Japanese tradition, the best of Japanese tradition, the best of Japanese values, never mind that all of the services are based on British models, the quintessentially Japanese system of serving the people would be lost through that. And that's partly why postal privatization has not been completely a done deal since Koizumi was in power.
So Arno has a question which actually fits in here. He says the populist argument is to serve the common man, and since there is no popular politician in Japan, does it mean that in essence the entirety of Japan is a populist state?
Oh, that's interesting.
To go that far.
That's interesting. Did one of the politicians, thank you for that question, but I think one of the interesting figures on that note is Koizumi Junichiro, who was viewed as a populist. And he was viewed as a populist in the sense that he went over the heads of the LDP and created direct ties with the people of Japan, with the voters. Nakasone did something similar. But he wasn't a populist in the sense that, you know, business is bad and we need policies for the common man. He was pushing a neoliberal agenda if there ever was one. He was a little different that way. So he kind of broke from the pack a little bit from your mainstream, middle of the road Japanese politician who, I don't want to overstate the issue, who were defenders of some of these distinctive institutions. He broke with that and tried to put Japan on a path that looks more like ours. So populism Japanese style, I think, is a little different. And true populists in Japan kind of defy, to my mind, those traditional Japanese values that are embedded in these institutional networks.
So we're getting a lot of pushback here for your enthusiasm, which you already announced, admitted that you're painting the positive picture for now, because for the purposes of this question of, avoiding the kaksa and providing policies for the common people. But here's some pushbacks, and pick the one that you want to answer. So Robbie says, by the way, Robbie wants to know, he thinks that financial institutions have an obligation of fiduciary duty, and didn't the post office, the savings part of the post office, completely ignore that? Jill wonders the same question a similar question, only she formulates it much better than I did previously, about the trade-offs. She says, there's also a negative way to telling the story of this enforced community, which is lack of privacy. The sort of the postal guy is sort of reading the letters, so to speak, right? And he knows what Watanabe-san is up to. And so there are all of these, there's a negative side to every single story that you just told. How does that, how do you view the postal workers from that? And then Robbie has another question on this and wants to know whether email and internet and so forth have actually disrupted all of this in the regions.
Yes. So yeah, here's two sets of pushbacks that I completely agree with. We just haven't really talked about it, but I'm glad these are on the table, because it's hard to write books like these without appearing to be an apologist for one side or the other. And I've tried really hard to find the balance between these contending visions of Japan. And it's not always easy to do that, because sometimes there are social ramifications of these programs that are beneficial to local communities, but they come with a huge economic price. And as Jill's pointed out, I think also a social price. It shows a level of interconnectedness at the neighborhood level, although this is breaking down, it has over the decades, that can be stifling, and it breeds a level of conformity that a lot of Japanese have rightfully rebelled against. So I completely agree with that. The economic ramifications, the financial ramifications are huge. The financial performance of the postal system, and one thing we didn't talk about that I think Robbie's getting to, is that postal savings deposits and postal insurance premiums get channeled through the post-war era into the fiscal investment and loan program, where they are further channeled through government policy into government financial institutions that invest in programs that serve the people in some ways. Small, and something I would like to hear from Ulrike, but I know that small business, as we were talking about earlier, is a major beneficiary of this. But as we know from the work of, say, Takeo Hoshi, these loans were boondoggles, and they were heavily influenced by politicking by the LDP. So when the government becomes the financial intermediary in the investment of household savings, there's a lot of room for mischief. And that was first and foremost in the mind, I think, of Koizumi, who wanted to stop this. And he had a very good point. That was the real negative underside of Japan's postal system, of the Philp system, in the wake of the bubble economy, when the commercial banks were struggling and the financial system more broadly was struggling. So yes, for every good thing that these systems do, there's a social or economic negative
Well,
side.
yeah, Social Security is not free, right? So let me just jump in there and say, I still want to defend this loan program way of providing Social Security. So what I mean with this is that the government used the postal office basically as a stash of money to fund a number of financial programs that would provide loans to small business owners. Right. And so this is where we also get into productivity measures and so forth between Japan and the United States. Mm-hmm. Because in Japan, the idea was that nothing good can come of a bankruptcy of a small firm. The owner would then go home, and there's a lot of shame, of course, with going to the Social Security office. So first of all, there's shame, which is really not so good, right? So, and then, they start drinking, they beat up on their wives, all kinds of bad things happen, right? So it's a social instability story that you could easily draw, by the way. Yes, and so the Japanese solution to this would then be, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give these guys a loan that we know they will not be able to repay. So there's no longer demand for tatami. There's no longer demand for dry cleaners in this area. So we'll just give them loans regardless. And so that means they have to get up in the morning. They open their store, they save face. Everybody says, "Oh, Shacho-san," right? And they kind of they'll or admire their work or whatever they can say, a nicety. And in the evening, they get home and they have a purpose and they need to get up and so forth, right? And so what we can't do, and I've tried, but what we can't do is figure out what the relative costs are. So would it be cheaper to let these guys close their stores and give them a monthly welfare check? Right? Or is it actually not that expensive to give them a loan that they don't repay? It's basically the same thing, except the one is camouflaged as a business activity, whereas the other is outright a redistribution from the rich people to the poor through the state office, right? And I actually have a little bit of a sweet spot for this, for the Japanese way of doing this, not only because it gets the guy out of bed in the morning and gives him a purpose, but also because it's actually possible that that's cheaper in terms of not causing as much social
dislocation.
That's the word I was looking for. And because the social dislocation is getting very expensive, not only in the United States. If you look around Europe, it's the same thing, right? And so people having a purpose is a really good thing. And so that's why I would defend it.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same, if I can just jump on that. And another example is, this was illustrated very starkly for me in Keishimizu when we were wandering through rural communities, various parts of the country, and meeting residents of dying villages, basically. And when you see these rice farmers, usually rice farmers, from a hard-nosed economic perspective, you were probably going to be tempted to say, these guys should go out of business. They're not efficient. They're not very productive. They're not efficient. The demand for rice is going way, way down. Why do we still have 70% of all Japanese farmers still producing rice? Let's just let them go away. Let them fade away. When they retire, no one takes over the family farm. That's the end. But from a social perspective, including a community perspective, that's a big deal. In farming, That's the end of precious farmland. That's the end of the network of the community. It disrupts local waterways and transportation networks, communication between rural and urban areas. It affects the fabric of society, as well as the livelihood of one elderly person who can't maintain his or her farm anymore. And that's at the heart of the political controversy, part of the political controversy over whether or not there should be more market reforms, market-oriented reforms, free market-oriented reforms within the agricultural system. It will mean these little farmers will go out of business, the part-time farmers who we think should be gone. But from a social, local policy perspective, it's politically and socially untenable.
So we have a lot of questions about the regions, right? So the regions are a big headache for Japanese policymakers because they're increasingly depopulated and old and shrinking and whatever, all of these negative words. And so some of what we're talking about here are really explicitly policies to make sure that the regions get something, right? That the regions stay intact. Just in case we need them in the future. So we don't want to close down, this town or this area, right? So, and also we have a sort of a social responsibility to take care of these people, and they're there and they're not moving. So, so again, I would say it's give the farmer a high price for the rice. And it keeps them busy, and they can, they can do their thing, and yeah.
Oh, Ruki, you froze for a minute.
I froze. No, I thought you froze. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, so we thought we had the Texas what did you just call this? The
Snowmageddon. It's back.
You're the ice woman. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, are we back? Are we good? I think we're good. So so let's talk a little bit more about the farmers. Not just so you have this new book coming out, which is takes a deeper look at the institutions, I think, that makes these types of social policies possible. What's your major takeaway there from talking to a bunch of farmers in Japan?
That's a huge question. So the book that we're working on looks at variations of institutional or strategic adaptation of individual agricultural cooperatives toward shifting market incentives. Why do some co-ops seem to change their habits and become more farmer oriented, more interested in improving farmer incomes and creating products that consumers really want? And why do some not do that? So that's sort of the portal through which we look at all of this. And in the process of doing so, we've learned a lot about how distribution works from the center to the regions, and how subsidies work. And just one example, as in keeping with the question you asked before, I froze myself out somehow. And then in relation to your more recent question, I had a good sense of the good and the bad that subsidies can do, for example. Sometimes subsidies are that added incentive that a farmer needs to take that extra risk to convert his fields for the production of a product that can be produced for export, for example. But sometimes a subsidy can be used to encourage a farmer to produce a product that really Japan doesn't need. And I would say feed rice is an example for that. And that it continues these inefficiencies. So I can see in the agricultural realm that the Japanese government is still trying hard to find a balance between not causing social disruption with reform, but also recognizing that the future of agriculture in the context of a declining population, an aging population, a farm population, only 50% of which have farm successors, an agricultural sector that's shrinking and may not be able to feed a significant amount of its people in the near future. How do you turn that around without disrupting the communities and the societies that are already in trouble? That's been a huge challenge, I think, for the government. and not always successfully addressed, I don't think. Agriculture policy is key to rural revitalization, going back to an earlier question. It's a major goal of the Abe administration and his successor, the Sube administration, trying to reinvigorate agriculture as a method for which to make rural communities more vibrant and more economically stable. Those are key policy goals, I think, of the region. But finding the right mix of policies that is politically tenable is very difficult.
So as you know, I am now working on a manuscript with the same co-author, Kei Shimizu. Right. And we actually had an earlier Japan Zoomina with Jesper Koll, where this also came up, right? That it's actually possible that there's a lucky moment right now where what you're talking about are these very inefficient farm practices of a shrinking farming population. Mm-hmm. And because Japan is sort of the front runner in this demographic change, it actually may be that there is a lucky moment for Japan where this negative trend that you're describing is actually counterbalanced by the digital transformation. So for example, in farming, we're now talking about vertical farming, right? So a vertical farm is a house downtown that is basically run by, it has many, many layers of farms, and then you can grow lettuce or strawberries, and it's all run by a machine learning mechanism and an algorithm, and it has light so many hours and this much water, and it's completely optimized. And the farmer of that vertical farm is no longer your old sort of bent over rice picker, right? It is a young techie that knows how to run an AI mechanism. Right. And already there are some farmers in Japan that are growing fast, that are really teched up, and they have those like the latest irrigation technologies and so forth and so on. So there is this generational shift happening, just as there is a technology shift happening. And I could tell the same story for the wholesalers, which will be disrupted by the digital transformation in terms of blockchain for logistics and the convenience store reaching out. But it doesn't matter, because the wholesalers are really a dying breed anyway, literally. And so very gracefully they can be phased out. Nobody loses their job, nobody is fired, nobody has to retrain. It's all just done very slowly, right? So, and I would add to this discussion that everything that we're talking about is very slow. How many years have we been talking about postal privatization now?
Well, 20? It started in the 90s.
Yeah, so it's a generation, right? It's
I look at it as the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, but the same is true for employment structures, right? We've been talking about changing employment in Japan for 25 years, enough to give a whole generation an opportunity to rethink what it actually means to work, and whether there is some sort of finding an identity for a person that is not tied to a particular company or work, right? So how about the JA, the Japan area? Wasn't it used to be called like Zenno or something?
Nokyo.
Oh, it was a Nokyo. Okay, so now it's Ja. Okay, so are they a dying breed as well? I mean, so what about the organization of these farmers, or any organization? The organization of wholesalers would be a similar construct, I guess.
Well, JA still operates on that equality principle, that every farmer deserves a chance to be a part of JA, and JA's job is to guarantee a certain income and to minimize risk. They haven't always got that balance right. Sometimes they take risk, they almost eliminate risk for the farmer, and they don't always give them the income that some farmers in a more free market setting might get. But JA is still a force to be reckoned with. And one of the surprising results of the research that we've just completed is that virtually 100% of Japanese farmers still belong to JA. But we have discovered that as a result of those AI guys, those high-tech farmers, et cetera, who are finding new ways to grow food, and they're high tech, they're entrepreneurial, they're innovative. They want to break out of the JA mold. We found that they stay a part of the JA, their local co-op, but at the same time, they pick and choose. They defect from some services. So they'll use JA in a pinch. They may use it to buy certain implements. But when it comes to marketing their product, they may have now an alternative route to market. So JA is still ubiquitous, but because of deregulation in the broader economy, JA now has more competition. So its market share is really shrinking. And farmers now have more choice. So because of more market competition, it's possible to get your stuff to market without going through JA channels and to get a higher price. And this often involves directly linking up with buyers, processors, major convenience store chains, and so on and so forth. So JA is shrinking, but it's still there. And that's part of the pressure for JA to reform if it doesn't step up to the plate and actually become more productive and serve farmers in a more efficient and profitable way. It's going to lose business, not members, it will lose business. So that's a rather convoluted answer to your question.
Which the Prime Minister Suga would really like to see, right? Because he doesn't like the JA losing power.
Yes, and that was part of the effort to reform the co-op system that came online in the past in 2015. So if Abe had had his way, the JA system, which is this pyramidal organization with really powerful organizations at the top that often dictate what the local co-ops do, they would have been just completely knocked off. And this would have been a network, more loosely organized network of local co-ops. He failed at that because of political pushback, including from within his own party. But he nevertheless, and his administration nevertheless managed to loosen some of the ties that bind those large national organizations to the co-ops. And that has given local co-ops and their farmers a little more freedom to adapt more flexibly to local market opportunities. So that's been positive, but a real small change.
So from a business perspective, there's a huge change associated with this, which is that the farmers in this case, but take any example, suddenly are becoming price setters and they are no longer price takers.
That's right.
And so they have to figure out how to set prices, which actually is something that Japanese companies in general are often not really that great at, because it's long been a system of price taking, right, rather than price setting. So Adam has a question that would wrap us up nicely. I think it might be a little bit take us where we've been before, but I think we're it's the time to ask this larger question. So his question is this: are there lessons in the universality of the institutions mentioned on how to avoid the most troublesome of market failures that arise in the provision of public goods? So if you look at healthcare or various types of infrastructure, is there anything that Japan can so for instance, what I'm thinking immediately in answer to Adam is, you talked about this informal welfare provision, which comes out of community and a sense of responsibility for each other, right? And yet, he thinks about the most troublesome of market failures, which I probably is, is maybe some of the corruption or some of the other things that you've already mentioned. So is there a way to square this circle, to have these societal cohesion creation mechanisms, and not fall prey to some of the grafting or whatever you want to call that might be associated with it? Or is that really a trade-off?
That's the hardest question of the night. I think it really is a trade-off, and policymakers are really struggling to find that sweet spot. I think it's different for every sector that we look at in a way. But stepping back from this research on the postal system and JA, I can't help but feel that in many ways, change must occur, sometimes at the expense of those social contributions. that the graft, the mismanagement of funds, and the systemic mismanagement of funds that's connected to these services, it can't go on forever. It's really a boondoggle. And so a lot of that has to change. And if I have one recommendation or one insight from all of this, and it's certainly not earth-shattering, it's that these sweet spots are found at the local level. It should be up to local society, local communities, villages and towns, even municipal governments, to figure out for their own communities, how do we reconfigure these networks to serve our purpose while they simultaneously become more market friendly? We've seen this happen sometimes with the co-ops and how co-ops are changing, and new partnerships between the co-ops and local government in some rural communities, as these co-ops simultaneously try to act more like corporations. And it's just Chiki seisaku, regional policy, local policy, I think is really instrumental in saving the networks, while at a more national level, the network as a whole is made more financially, economically viable.
There are very interesting parallels to this in the current discussion of lifetime employment, which has become too much of a straitjacket, so it has to be loosened up. But can an individual company still uphold some of the cohesion and all of the good stuff that is also associated with lifetime employment while loosening up the restrictions around that at the margin? And also, so on a final note on that, Jim Fallows and his wife Debbie did a book on the United States, where they flew around
Our towns,
flew around the US and went to the ground level, and they basically would Jim would probably echo every single thing you just said. That is, we used to have this in the US. We used to have it, right? And so we're losing it. So what can we do to stop losing it?
I would say, reading Jim Fallows' book, that's a really interesting book. And I think that's spot on, that innovation can happen at the local level. Resources are sometimes a problem, but that bottom-up change in a society that might be in trouble and is seeking a way forward, empowering localities is really key.
Thank you, Patty. Time is up, unfortunately. We only have an hour. So I want to thank you for joining us today. It was a fantastic conversation. And thank you, audience, for staying with us. Next week, we'll have Takeo Hoshi. And until then, please stay safe and happy. And I'll see you next week. And thank you, Patty.
Thank you for having me. And to everyone who attended.
Goodbye. Take good care.